Hello, and welcome to The Fourth Culture. My name is Ramji. Today we're going to do a review of something that was sent through to us by our friends over at the Unbreakable RPG. We've been playing a few of these games on Wednesday night. I think you may have seen a couple of them. Joe has adapted one, which was from the first anthology for 5th edition, and Lisa was playing one that she just finished last night, in fact. The newest release by the folks over at Unbreakable RPG, which is called Unbreakable Revolution. And so we're going to talk a little bit about just a brief overview of it. And to give some context, the folks over at Unbreakable are a group of Asian authors. They are primarily based in North America, so it is written from a North American Asian view, but it is done in a manner that I think is, so far that I've seen, is rather impeccable when it comes to having a sense of cultural context, sensitivity, and diligence, perhaps one might say, in at least making sure that the material is spoken to by people who have authentic voices, and it is illustrated by people who are within culture, and a whole bunch of other things that I consider to be part of the norm of these days, and we'll see it as we go through it, but are sadly lacking from other publications. So we're going to go through their latest release, which is Unbreakable Revolution, which is currently now on Drive-Thru RPG. They've sent us a press copy kindly, and we're not going to go through everything in massive detail, but we are going to talk a little bit about the stories, some of my impressions and thoughts. The TLDR, if you've got this far in the video on demand or on YouTube, and please, if you have, take a moment to follow, like, subscribe, and do whatever you need to do to, smash the like button or hit the follow button, various other things that we're supposed to be asking you all to do. So please do that. But I think the biggest thing I would say is that Unbreakable Revolution, as the name implies, it is a conversation about the reality of some human conflicts in both realistic historical and also a mythical Asian setting. And I think that's a very interesting thing to explore. It is also not purely for D&D. It is multi-system and actually therefore very adaptable. But I think we need to delve into it a little bit. I'm quite excited to. I had a very brief skim through it earlier, so I'm very much coming to this with the same set of eyes that you hopefully all are. But yeah, all right, so let's get rocking and rolling. So here we go, Unbreakable Revolution. The first thing I would say about Unbreakable Revolution, as you can see, it is rather revolutionary. It is very much of a particular style, and I like it. I like the style they've adopted. I like the fact that this is a unapologetically political work. It's not necessarily to say that this is a work that is putting forward a particular political philosophy, though obviously it is. It's putting forward a rather open North American liberal philosophy, but I would still say that's not at direct opposition to many of the stories. As always, Jackie Leung, who is I believe, the producer and project manager of the first version, is going to be the creative lead on this one. And one of the things I like about this book is they're very, very good at doing attributions and at making sure people get credit for their work, which I think is often one of the problems of works involving contributors who may be considered underrepresented. They often don't tend to get represented. So they do a superlative job at this. So we're just going to get through, some of the basic contents of it. There are, I didn't actually count them explicitly, but let's have a look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 adventures in this. And they are, again, quite, as I said, a little bit political, a little bit interesting. They are often stories of conflict or some sort of violent uprising or similar, but not entirely. And to give a very high-level view of these 7, many of them are set in the sort of the Philippines, or 2 of them are set in the Philippines, I think. 2 of them are in India. One of them is set in a sort of generic, I believe it's a sort of generic China, and one is set, I think, in a Vietnam, post-colonial, pre-colonial Vietnam setting, sort of give or take. I think I only counted 5 there, so let me just double-check. So there were, this one is China, this one is Vietnam. This one, sorry, pardon me, is in San Francisco, I believe. Then we have India, Philippines, and India again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Cool. So let's dig into this a little bit and see where it takes us. A bit of introduction blurb, and then some views about what system is relevant. So yes, they're able to be adapted, I think, pretty much to any system. There's no massive chunks of rules or rule specificity. What I like, again, is they do talk a bit about safety tools. They do talk a little bit around how to use lines, veils, X cards they refer to as well. These are pretty standard ways of providing some level of safety in the game, and especially when you're playing something that is a little, I wouldn't say there's anything particularly close to the edge in this content. I think it is an interesting and well-written series of adventures that people can pick up and run. But there's nothing that makes me feel that, oh my God, this is terrifying. But it's very easy to me to say that, but someone else may well find that there are things in here that are content that triggers them, or that content they feel uncomfortable with. One of the nice things they do is, for each adventure, they explicitly call out the things that are potentially content concerns. And on top of that, they do preface it in the book here to say, hey, sit down with your players, talk about things, which I think we have referred to many times when we think that, in general, the concept of lines and veils and the concept of table safety is very important. It's become more of a thing recently. People are talking about it a lot more, which is great. Now, the first game, or the first adventure, is Big Rat, Don't Eat My Millet. It is set in, again, I believe it's set in a sort of generic Middle China in the way that many adventures are in the sort of the Chinese folklore and mythology context. So it's not a specific setting, if I recall correctly. Now, however, the main character is King Rat. And one of the things it is really, really that strikes me that's about this book is that it is both a mixture of a story and a folklore education, which I think is wonderful. And I think that was true of Unbreakable. I think this is true of the first volume for 5e. I think this is sort of true for this as well, which is, although perhaps a bit less folklore, it still has a fair amount of these nice yellow boxes that give you a bit of a cultural context and a bit of historical context as we get a little bit further in. I like that. It is nice to have these little bits of content dropped in without them being a lecture. And I think one of the things we're very conscious of as, I wouldn't say alternate culture, but certainly as underrepresented cultural contributors, is lecturing. So this adventure is very much about, very much structured in a few chapters, and is very much about how are you going to deal with King Rat. And as you can see, the artwork for this is varied and gorgeous in many cases, and certainly it's very fun. This adventure is, I don't want to give away the ending too much, but is a adventure that is written by Casey She, and they go by she, her pronouns, so that's great, and they're based in Los Angeles. I think that the goal is to, again, represent a Chinese Asian, by which I mean some sort of, they say that it's inspired by the Western Zhao dynasty, and I think there is an element of really reaching back into a story from a long time ago. But I think, it's a really nice and good kickoff adventure for it. Again, part of what's characteristic about this is that there is no game context specificity. It is not a 5e game with 5e rules and 5e blocks. So if that is what you're looking for, be warned that this isn't how it's going to be. You have to put a bit of work in as a DM here, but not a huge amount, but enough that it's there that these are story beats and context and other ways of reacting, but not necessarily mechanical. There are a couple of games in this pack that do have a bit of mechanical context to them, but on the whole, I would say this is very much more adventure inspiration and, for want of a better phrase, scripting. The next one is one that I really enjoyed. It's really good fun. It's called Days of Powder, Plunder. Start again. It's called Days of Powder, Plunder, and Plot. It is set in a colonial Vietnam, and it is a piracy adventure, which I think, we're sort of used to the pirates of the Spanish Main. We're used to the concept of sort of whether it's Sir Francis Drake or Blackbeard or Bluebeard or any random coloured beard you may have. This, on the other hand, however, is a frigate that is called the Soleil, and you are basically looking to board it and take it. And it is really the entirety of this adventure is about boarding the frigate and capturing it, as well as the booty on it. And I think it's great. It's really enjoyable. If you've ever wanted to do a shipborne adventure, I think you're on the right path here. It's also a nice chunk of anti-imperial, anti-colonial context of what that time, which I guess is sort of during the point of the French colonization of, is a really, really interesting subject. And I think one of the things that then grabbed me as I then came across it was this beautiful picture. And this is a consistent theme throughout the whole of the Unbreakable series in general, but specifically this book as well, which is that I think the art is gorgeous. And I think the art is gorgeous for a bunch of reasons. One is when I look at this art, I see Asia. I see Southeast Asia. I see whether it's Halong Bay or whether it is in the sort of the karst islands that are part of northern part of Phuket in Thailand. The geography is well represented, and I think that's beautiful. And the art in general in this book is beautiful and culturally correct. As odd as that statement sounds, it reminds me of both the art and the language and the sort of landscape and the culture of the places that I live in and travel in. Again, a very nice image here as we sort of carry on. I'm not going to spoil any of these stories, but the net of it is that you get through the pirate adventure. Obviously, there is a bit of daring do, and again, very nice sort of imagery here. And as we get to we're looking at a fair amount of content right now. As we get towards the end of it, we can see that in the author's notes, we talk about the adventure being inspired by dramatized history of Vietnam, but also blending that with the classical pirate tropes. And I think that's the thing that is so very important as we do this, which is that nobody wants to alienate anybody from having fun in order to have a culturally appropriate, history lesson. This is about sitting down at a table with your friends and having or virtual table with your friends and playing a game. And so the goal is to still pick up some of that swashing some buckles, as the expression might go. Wonderful. So again, lots of great credits here, as they've talked about many times that I like the way, as I've talked about many times, I like the way they give credit here. Some good stuff, some basic. This is what I mean when I say it's sort of roughly system independent. As you can see here, it talks about some NPCs, and it gives you a rough view of, hey, look, so a Marine Sergeant will have 3 hit dice. So in let's say maybe in D&D, that would give them a Marine Sergeant is probably a fighter of some sort, so I'll give them 3d10. Here there's 2d8 damage and 1d6, and it's basing this around some rough concepts, and you can adapt it very, very easily. On a successful attack, target is grappled and pull 1 movement further from the surface each turn. It's written nicely. It's a thing I can go, cool, I can just take this and adapt it very easily. Some pretty sensible maps, some nice things here, obviously with the press on top of it, but very, very good. Here we start to see some really, really fun and funky art. I'm a fan. So this is a adventure by Pam Punzalan, and it is for a setting called Forged in the Dark. I'm not that familiar with Forged in the Dark as a game, but again, very easily adapted. All of this stuff is very easily adapted, though I think it's fair to say that some of it, the cultural and historical context is important, and this is definitely one of those. It's meant to be for about 3 or 4 hours. The content warning around this is colonial violence, profaning of Christian beliefs and imagery, and it does have some body horror in it. And the net of this story is that it is set in, I think, just pre-1900s-ish Philippines, where the Spanish Governor General is purportedly to be possessed. In fact, there we go, possessed by Beelzebub, the demon of hell. Now, it is there is this concept of the Order of Iscariots, it's a shadow organization. It's sort of very much more set for that trope of, for want of a better phrase, it's the Call of Cthulhu League of Extraordinary Gentle Persons, and similar, secret society fighting against supernatural horror type of settings. Though that doesn't have to be particularly unique to a modern setting. You can take a lot of the stuff and then play it elsewhere. One of the things that it's worth noting, though, is that there is a need for some of the interplay between the colonial power and the folks who are living under the colonial power, the colonized, if you will, to continue to exist for some of the narrative tension. And I think there is a point at which one has to be. Let me just. I'm reading this correctly. Oh, you know what? I may have misrepresented. Sorry, pardon me. Father's rebellion raged along the uphill where the Governor General still have control. Yes, that's right. No, the Governor General is still challenging the power of the crown. Okay, that's fine. So year one of the Philippine Revolution. Okay, got it. This adventure is designed like a structured sandbox full of story hooks, the few suggested directions for the score rather than the set narrative. I'm learning as I go here. So backgrounds give players a better context of what each entails within the 1800s Filipino context. And I think the point I was making there is that this is set strongly in an 1800s Filipino context, meaning that translating this into a game of D&D might be quite difficult if you are playing in a very high fantasy D&D game. You may be able to take the core of the story itself, but it may be a bit more difficult to just pick it up and drop it. I could definitely see this being a thing you could drop into a slightly more modern setting, perhaps an Eberron or something similar to that. So there we go. Different bits about playbooks: the Barong, the Sigbin, Gorona, Sundos, and each of them has a very specific set of abilities and contexts. There's your face over here. There is the politicians over there. I think there is a fair amount of content here, and then there's a bit about who the crew are, who are the hunters of the Order of the Iscariot, and they are exorcists, monster hunters, and supernatural investigators from an international network of Christian warriors. So this is written from a very Christian context, not necessarily a very bombastic context, but it's written from a context of this is the belief system and the faith that is prevalent throughout the story. So if that's something you're not going to be into, then maybe this one isn't for you. So I'm going to skip through the majority of the adventure, but you can see the long and the short of it is that there is a Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, has possessed the Governor General. And really, it's the story is, well, and then so what? What do you do about it? How are you going to resolve the problem? And then what happens afterwards? And Pam is a game designer, writer, editor, sensitivity and culture consultant, community organizer from the Philippines, who has been featured in Sundo, We Once Mortal, as well as the Islands of Sinouna, as well as, there's the ancestry and cultural design for D&D 5th edition. As you can see in the bio, it says that their games are explorations on the fringe and recollections of topics that are often barred to her and her own adaptations of popular tropes and archetypes. And I want to make clear that I think I fluffed a bit at the beginning where I talked about when it was set. I think it is set just in the Revolutionary War, rather than it is in the fully colonial era. So good stuff, and a dedication to Hidetaka Miyazaki. 1896, says JR in chat. Thank you very much, JR. So talks a bit about the different factions and some really, oh, that's quite good. A nice little appendix about Christianity and religious syncretism. So how the leaders have used Christian symbolism and native traditions to radicalize their subordinates. Very nice. It's a nice bit of context there. And here we come to Bad Luck Fortune by Dorian Chin. Oriented around 5th edition and D20 systems, it's primarily a ghost story set in Chinatown, and it's set in the late 70s. So that is a relatively modern story, and it is bringing to mind some of the Chinatown of, I guess, what would have been movies when I was a kid. And so, to be clear, though, this is a horror story. There is general horror, gang violence, dead parents, family members, supernatural aging, loss of body autonomy, kidnapping, imprisonments, drowning, orphanages, cemeteries, funerals, alcohol, gambling, firearms, knives, hatchets, and axes. So, if you're not up for any of those things, this again may not be the story for you. And kind of skip ahead in the video or just pause for a bit. But I think there is a strongly Cantonese context to this. It is a story that is based around a family who I believe have taken over or have a investigation agency or detective agency. It starts with a celebration of the reopening of the King Ho Detective Agency. And then it carries on. And so Johnny's gone missing. And as you can see here, you got some fun stuff. This is a sort of nice image of San Francisco in the Chinatown in the 70s. I'm presuming this is dated from the 70s. The cars look like it. The street looks like it. Yeah, very nice. Though I've got to say, it's probably not massively different from when I first went there in the 90s. And so, without, again, giving away any spoilers or any particular context to it, you can see it's got a nice few set of puzzles here. Set in the modern era, it is not, I don't think, uniquely modern in that I think it is... What I think this is doing is it is speaking from the context of a Cantonese culture, Asian American, and talking about something that they have both a context and a perspective on talking about, which is, Chinatown in the 70s in San Francisco. So it shouldn't be too difficult for somebody to take this, if they wanted to, and transplant it, because perhaps you aren't familiar with Chinatown in the 1970s. Perhaps you want to transplant this to London in the 1970s. Perhaps you want to translate this somewhere else altogether. I think it's going to require some work, but it's very doable. Then obviously, if you're not in a dock town, there's going to be some interesting things you need to add. If you want to take this back into the 1900s or into a fantasy setting, I think some things are going to need a bit more work. There are telephones and Polaroid cameras and various other things like that in the course of this, but I think it's still pretty rad, and it does evoke. And the nice thing about this is that the actual images and imagery in the writing do evoke a very nice and somewhat nostalgic walk back to this point. We're going to just come up towards the end of it. As you can see, it's a reasonably large adventure. It's pretty good. There is, again, the art of, as we get to the big bad, and their lair. This is written by Dorian Chin, uses she, they, someone of mixed race, and they are a writer of horror narratives featuring haunted childhoods, cursed families, and spaceships that love you back. That sounds like the name of a ship from... an Ian Bax culture novel, which is I Love You Back, but wonderful, and that's great. And so that's by Dorian, and is, I think, now the fourth adventure that we have just quickly had a flip through. So as we then look at the next one, This is set, I believe, in India, and this is by Rajiv Kalita, and it's called The Crimson Uprising. It has as a content warning oppression, inequity, gaslighting, immolation, torture, child abduction, violence against children and enders, and I think it is basically meant to be a bit of an insight into how the caste system, which is a particularly ancient, in essence, stratified class system that is primarily known. It's sort of India is primarily known for the caste system, but it is something that has existed elsewhere and is propagated primarily, I would say, by Hinduism as a religion, but it is excellent in other cultures as well. One comment that I really like about this is it's not possible to solve a deep-rooted systemic problem such as this in 6 hours. And I actually think that with a lot of these things where people are talking about their own context, there is an expectation that there is some solution. And I don't think that there is in many cases. You can't tackle the problem of colonialism or slavery or the caste system, religious persecution, various other things like that, and have a solution in a few minutes. But you can have a fun adventure and a conversation that is culturally appropriate and contextual, which I think is really what the folks who have been putting these wonderful adventures together are going for. So this is based on a D20 system again, and talks about how every year on the first day of spring, the village of Gunori celebrates the festival of Jetuka. Which commemorates the victory of good over evil. An infant prince was saved from the fire by the gods themselves, while an indigenous woman named Jaddu was sent to burn the child, burned to death herself. The legend is a story made by upper caste conquerors and is still celebrated this day with a gruesome and hidden twist. And so the story then leads sort of on about how you basically have a choice. There is a nice little box over here where it talks about the fact that the reality is that this is denoting a particularly and arbitrarily sexist culture, which, let's be honest, is an accurate portrayal of many of the villages and cultural realities that have existed in the Indian subcontinent and to a large extent still do exist in the Indian subcontinent. I like the image below. It has a certain photorealism that is very authentically reminds me of India. I must say that street is a little cleaner, though I can see a bit of garbage at the end, than I would imagine many Indian cities to be. But nevertheless, the sadhu with the sort of the tiffin box walking down the street adds an extra level of authenticity, which I think is really awesome. So as we carry on through here, we sort of go through this nice, bright, vibrant colors. And I think the interesting thing is the colors speak well to context. Color has a lot of meaning in Asian cultures and when I use the word Asian, by the way, I want to be clear. I use the word Asia to mean anything that is to the right, or as I like to call it, certainly to the east of Greece, meaning that things that, in the way that people refer to things that are the West, as anything to the left or to the west of Turkey, I like to consider Asia basically to start at Turkey. And so in many ways, because culturally that's appropriate. Now, that's not to say that I don't wish to consider that things that have happened in what would be referred to as the Middle East or in the Levant or any other areas like that don't have their own context, but it's more of when I refer to an Asian context, I'm using a much broader term and a more geographic term. So we talk about some food. One of the things I like in adventures, and one of the things I referred to before, is that when you're trying to create a cultural context, when you're trying to bring to life something about a place, you want to talk about, as a DM, a few things. You want to talk about, obviously what you see. You want to talk about what you hear. You want to talk about what you smell, and you want to talk about what you taste and what you touch. And I think this is an important distinction of how do you bring alive a different culture. You can obviously just describe, so you come and you see a tall, person, and they appear to be wearing, and you can just describe things. And one of the things that, as I think Matt Culver talks about, or refers to, one of the problems of describing things is that when you describe things to your party, they expect them to have some sort of meaning. So if you say you look at the wall and there is a green moss on the wall, they're like, green moss. I need to know what that green moss does, because later on I might need that green moss, right? So as a GM, your gaze, the things that you highlight, out of all of the things that possibly could be highlighted to your party, will all be considered significant. And I think that's important. So when you are highlighting things, you want to highlight things that will, by their significance, convey the cultural context that you're after. So what I always like, and I think is a missed trick by many folks, is food. Because food has all of the things that appeal to our senses. Food looks a certain way, smells a certain way, tastes a certain way. Food has a certain texture to it. And I think that's it's a missed opportunity when folks don't bring that to life. Now, of course, if everybody at your table is not into food and doesn't like it, or has issues with food, you may want to skip across that as your appropriate descriptor. But it's definitely a trick that many people miss. And I think that one of the things that has been done very well in this particular adventure is to actually talk about the food, more than talk about the food. There's no effect of eating the sweets other than the sugar high, but to really get into some of the details. The food has got images, and it has, there are associated drinks that go with it, and you have the tandai, and it has milk and dried fruits and trace amounts of a mild intoxicating plant, right? And that's true. A lot of those drinks do have a small bit of oomph to it, right? And I think that is it's really nice. Right? I mean, this is I'm reading through this and it's making me smile, even if I'm not necessarily going to want to run the adventure myself, because for whatever reason, putting that aside, right? But it talks to me as somebody who has cultural context around eating some of these sweets at friends' houses, or being able to recognize the colors or the various things that go with it. And I think that is something that is just genuinely joyous about the whole of this. In fact, in fairness, the production of Unbreakable in general, but specifically this one so far, there is a nice recognition value when I look at some of the art, when I look at some of the food and the culture and everything else. These are things that are recognizable to me. A rather disturbing image of somebody that is on a pyre, and then a bit more in the way of context about who the rebels are, and what is happening and how things are going in the game. Again, more food imagery, which I love, and I think that is even though, again, not necessarily my favorite food, but very much something I recognize. And you see the rose petals there, and I know what that smells like. I know what that tastes like. It evokes a very particular type of image of what celebrations are like. And I think that's something that's done very well. Good use of color, and it's a very well put together book, I would say. It's sort of the colors and the food and everything is both a visual and game-oriented feast. One of the nice things they do, by the way, I think it's really nice, is there's a pronunciation guide associated. It's well-edited book. There's a pronunciation guide that is associated with each person's name. So, for example, you can see here, there is Avani's mother. It says Revati, and then for folks just to be able to say it, a very straightforward pronunciation, which is Ravati, right? So there you go. So her name is Ravati. Okay, good. Right, so or Ravati, if you want to, because it's not the be all and end all pronunciation, but it certainly steers you right, and it's not Rivati, right? And I think that's probably a good point. So as we kind of carry on through here, very nice sort of set of images, and I think one of the things as we get to a bit later, we can sort of I'll just skip down towards the end. Talks about how the nice bit of art here. And they're sort of like, group of rebels. And again, the art is in the style of things that I would see in an art form in the subcontinent as well, which I think is really nice. I don't think this is it is by no means it's not represent. Sorry, let me rephrase that because it's a nice thought. I feel that art is authentically appropriate for somebody that is describing that and saying, I want to draw a picture of this. And I'm like, oh yeah, that picture is drawn by somebody who understands that art style. Now, whether you like it or not is independent of the fact that I feel that it's genuine, and I like that about the entire of this this book. So the author wants to talk a little bit about the fact that the politics is rooted in caste-based oppression and violence is commonplace in many regions of India today, and it explains what is to many the true context of a popular festival. And I think that is true of many festivals, and it's true around the world, by the way. Many festivals are based around a particular saint's day or something happening, and when you look into the reality of what that saint actually did, that saint may well have been, saint persecutor. Right, many of the things that people are having to deal with are that the statues that are in their cities right now are statues of people who were slaveholders, or that they were actually involved in perpetuating acts that were pretty horrible things. And I think that there is a good conversation to be had there. One of the other things I think is really nice about this particular one is that Rajib kind of gives some credit to Kevin, and basically because he's taken something from the communist Vietnam forces in the Vietnam War and brought it into something that the rebels will be using in this cultural context in India. And so he's basically got Kevin to kind of have a look at it. And pretty rad. Rajib is based in India, based in Mumbai, and he's a car designer. So there we go. Nice little pronunciation guide here, just for folks who want to get into the pronunciation of things. Let's quickly skip over the maps. I don't want to give away too much. But again, some very, very nice art. Just like showing representations of what the places are like. And I think, like, one of the things I find particularly, I like architecture. I like descriptive and narrative stories. And so I think that one of the things that is always going to be enjoyable about describing places that have a very interesting and detailed style, especially if it's not somewhere you're familiar with, is the fact that as somebody that may not have been to you may not have been to Rajasthan, you may not have been to Northern India, you may not have been to Southern India, you may not be able to say, well, look, it's just like, it's the step on the front of a temple, you all know what that's like, right? Instead, you actually get to go on an adventure with your players where you actually get to describe these things. You actually get to talk about the fact that there's a moat that goes around this area here where people have to cross across a small wooden bridge, and as they do so, you can hear their sandals as they slap against their feet as they reach another area beyond that, where they actually take their sandals off, wash their feet before they enter into the temple area, and you can see that there's a pile of sandals off on the left-hand side, and there are sellers of blood. There are all these sort of things that you can evoke about that scene, which will be new to you, and certainly so many of them are new to me, and they'll be new to your players, and you get that thing that I think as a DM is something we all like, which is a sense of joint discovery. You're investigating your world at the same time as your players are, and I think that's something that there's quite a lot of that in this book, which I think is a lot of fun. Quickly paging on, we get to the next one, and this scenario is optimized for the Iron Sworn RPG, which is a GM-less system for solo group play, known as the Mountain Shroud, and it's by Ari Santiago. And it is, again, I believe, set in the sort of 19th century Spanish colonial sort of Philippines. The content warning is violence, character bodily harm via weapons, animals, and fire, racial and religious prejudice, social stratification, and prejudice reflective of Spanish colonial society in the Philippines circa 19th century. Characters embark from a remote colonial settlement on a quest to find the origin of an apparently blessed artifact, a shroud bearing the likeness of the Divine Virgin, though one with unconventional features. So I suspect that the core of that story is going to be, again, the tension between a Christian church based around, it's always the one. It's the Christian church based around the concept that Jesus was white and therefore Mary was whiter, versus the reality of everybody's faith being oriented around themselves, and faith being an incredibly personal thing. This particular story has some beautiful art to it. Really just absolutely gorgeous. And they do a great job of accrediting it towards the end, and we'll go through that because I do think many of the artists need to be specifically called out. But this is just a lovely, lovely image, and I am entranced by it on so many levels. Long before the Empire conquered the land, Mount Salambuan was held as a sacred site where humans communed with spirits. The mountain's harsh terrain, dense woods, and steep slopes deterred invaders, allowing old beliefs and new apostasies to flourish unhindered. The mountain's environs are a forbidding frontier where people go to escape orthodox society. These outcasts include bandits, rebels, refugees, and keepers of the old faith. Consorting with them is outlawed, but most border barangays trade with them out of necessity. Talks a bit about the world truths. So the scenario uses a custom setting. You may use the following prompts to determine world truth or expanding existing ones. So characters live in the colony of Lusong, an archipelago ruled by the distant maritime empire of Ispira. The colony has not been completely subjugated despite over a century of oppressive foreign rule. The highest tiers of government are held by Ispirans, with Indios relegated to the lower ranks. So this doesn't specifically use Filipinos and colonial Spanish in the way that the previous adventure earlier on with the Governor General was very much set in the historical context. Instead, it is a bit more generalized to allow you to be able to drag and drop it to wherever you want to. But they do give you some very nice notes here. So it's pretty awesome. Does obviously involve the church, does obviously involve Catholicism, which is fine. So the chapter 1, Tatlon Sawa. So the adventurers come across the titular Shroud and embark on a quest to discover its origins. By the end of this chapter, the party should be en route to San Ludas, a distinct barangay where chapter 2 unfolds. And so, as I said before, I won't go through everything because I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but as you can see, there is a nice thoughtful kickoff to the quest, bit of context about what the Shroud is, and again, some more beautiful art. One of the things I think is, again, I said just very enjoyable, is just the references that artists use here are references that are contextual for if you've grown up or live in this area or this region, you recognize things. You recognize the fact that, there are things in the trees that are shaped that way. There are fruits and nuts in the trees that are like that. There are, this is the shape of people and the color of them and everything that goes with it. Really awesome. So keeping going, and there is a journey that goes. There are some things that need to be done. Conflicts with the both the folks that are unhappy locally, as well as the colonial power that is imposing themselves. Until we kind of run our way through to an ending, and I'm not going to again spoil that. And let's just talk a little bit about who the author is. The author bio. Ari is a freelance writer from the Philippines who got started in tabletop RPGs with D&D 3.5e, now plays mostly 5e, City of Mist, and Ironsworn. In addition to pen and paper games, their hobbies include fantasy and weird fiction, video games, and collecting action figures. Also a bit of a visual novel nerd. So that is The Mountain Shroud by Ari, and that is the penultimate of the stories in this particular book. The last story is one called The First Diya of Navratri, and that is written by Charu Patel. It is a game that is optimized for Gun and Slinger, which again is another RPG system, and the Sword and Bearer supplement for 1 maestro or 2 to 4 players. But I think, again, having a quick read through it, it is relatively adaptable. Content warnings around this one. Again, 4 to 6 hour game, and I think almost all of the adventures have been a 4 to 6 hour adventure, which really means for us on the stream, it's a 2-shot, possibly a 3-shot. Certainly for most players, it is a full game session, if not 2. So, content warnings: racism, colonizers. There's some themes here, right? Racism, colonizers, cultural and religious oppression, foreign invaders, prisoner imprisonment, snakes, and mentions of murder. Foreign invaders have crossed the threshold of Mithvani, the region, seizing control of the villages and roadways, both between the villages and leading to the city. That's the roadways between the villages and Eden City. No one is sure where these invaders came from or whether the city is aware of their presence. Once they arrived, the land began to morph. And there are rumors of an increased presence of the twist, which I presume is something that is contextual to Gunslinger and Sword and Bearer, but I also think is just some sort of chaos warping, effect that we can all reasonably easily pick up. It could be wild magic, it could be, an incursion of some sort, whatever your system is. The Mithvani village plan to celebrate Navratri. How they pronounce Navratri is Navratri. Okay, fine, Navratri. In secret, the village leaders have tasked the party to escort Maharaj Atamdaras, a local priest, to pick up festival supplies, weapons, and information about the invaders. Though either roads or fields, guards, or Pridvashas present different kinds of danger to the Maharaj and group. So it's an interesting thing here, right? So Maharaj is a title that means high king or great king. Though in this context it is referring to a priest. I'm 100% certain that it's an appropriate term because somebody this production prides itself on accuracy and cultural context. But it's interesting to me as somebody that's obviously not from this region of India originally, that you would have a priest that's called Maharaj. It's enjoyable. So the party seeks to light the spark of rebellion, as well as it's a fetch quest with some rebellion thrown in. In Gunslinger, here we go, you either play as a sentient magical weapon or the person that bears that weapon. In this setting, magic is commonplace, but people are not as familiar with this type of magic. And there's the twist touch, okay? This is interesting. So the characters can be from anywhere in the world, but right now they live in Jawardi, one of the 10 Mithvani villages. Although the city distrusts the wilderness outside the city, the Mithvani villagers have lived nearby without much trouble. It does seem to have some customization oriented towards this game, but so far, and look, another beautiful image here. And Navratri is a time of, these sort of ghee lanterns will be lit. There are many of these sort of coal, beautiful mandalas and similar decorations which are drawn in front of people's houses or on the streets or various other places. And that is something that this artist here has captured, I think, really, really well. Both the deep hues of purple of a night that has been pierced by a kind of the golden light from these sort of ghee lamps, and ghee is that clarified butter that's often from used multi-purpose use, as well as the brighter colors of the coal and the writing itself. Very nicely done. The adventure is optimized for Sword and Bearer, and the base rules of Gun and Slinger references the city of Sword and Bearer, including additional lore. This adventure can be run using either rule set or by doubling up. If you're using only Gun and Slinger, blah, blah, blah. So I don't think it talks about how to modify it for a non-Gun and Slinger or Sword and Bearer setting. But it does talk a little bit about this Pridvashas and Priket concept. Pridvashas are nature spirits that exist in the Mithvani region. Pridvashas look like large versions of the animals native to this area. They are vibrantly colored and have added features such as extra eyes or limbs. So there is a hint of the Miyazaki about this. They have the ability to stay invisible until they wish to address villagers. Stories are passed down that they controlled all of the land and gradually gave it as gifts to the mortal beings that lived in the city. Many believed that the Pridvashas fled to the Mithvani region because the rest of the city forgot them. There are also theories that the twist may have caused this move. Pridvashas have their own magic power and their own agendas that exist outside their dealings with mortals. Priket is land that is owned by the Pridvashas. Their lands are not bound by the climate of the region, and their weather can be vastly different from that of the nearby villages. So there are these microclimates that mean that as part of the adventure structure, you're able to move around. And then it talks a little bit about Gujarati Navratri. And so in Gujarat, and Gujarat is a part of northern India, it's always contextual as to what Northern India, Southern India actually is, but I would say that to be very accurate about this, I'm going to just pull up a very simple map. So that is where the Gujarati state is. So it is basically over in the north left of India, if you will. So if you consider where my family is originally from in India, which is down here in the bottom right, or I believe some people would quaintly call it southeast, in the up left or northwest, we might say, that is where Gujarat is. And so it's not surprising that there are different cultural context terms and traditions given both the size and complexity of the subcontinent. But in Gujarat, Navratri is a festival of 9 days that celebrates 9 aspects of the goddess Shakti. The most well-known part of the festival in Gujarat is Garba, the communal folk dance. Feasts, socializing, and fasting during the day are also part of the celebration. The feast uses many diyas, oil lamps, for both decoration and as part of pujas, which are religious ceremonies. The festival is celebrated in myriad of ways across India, which is about the point I was just making, and many different states and regions celebrate different gods and goddesses in this period. The Navratri Wikipedia page is a great state to start if you'd like more information. If a player celebrates Navratri differently, they're absolutely encouraged to add that to their playthrough of this adventure. The addition of festivals to appease Pradvashas, however, is unique to this setting. It's unique to the setting, but it may actually not necessarily be unique to India, where this sort of syncretism of like, well, it's, in fact, it's true of the world. Hey, I have a festival. I'm going to use it to blend in a local religious or cultural thing and make that part of the celebration. And over time, that becomes part of the rich tapestry of what it means to have, a wonderful human culture and all that stuff. I think there is a lovely thing about that. Now, where were we? Good stuff. Okay, so lighting the match. This is how it all kicks off and how the story gets going. Oh, here we go. Nice. The Maharaj. That was just the thing I was mentioning earlier, actually. Maharaj is a regional colloquial definition in Gujarati for priest. The definition is used in rural villages in Gujarat, the region that inspired this adventure, near the towns of Navsari, Gandevi, and Bilimora. The common word for priest in Gujarat is padari. Paduri. Okay. You may use this word instead if you choose. Characters may use the title Maharaji, okay, in place of their full name and title when addressing Maharaj Atamdaras. So yes, you would say Maharaji, in place of their full name, so you can use it as titular. But yeah, so that's the thing I was saying that's quite amusing, is that the Maharaj would not be a title that I think in the cultural context that I am aware of would be used for a priest. But okay, so as we then look, you then get into a bit more, again, the beautiful pictures and imagery again. And I think one of the things that I am enjoying as I look through the book is the architecture has very small details that are very appropriate, like this sort of slightly, it's not a straight arch. It's got a certain curve to it. It's like a wiggly line, if you will, that is very, very reminiscent of many of the buildings and structures, especially the ruined ones that you'll often see. And so, again, there are more stories of the obstacles, the things you have to go through, and beautiful images. Look at this multicolored serpent in this rice field surrounded by a jungle with a deep sort of mountain in the background. And these colors are so very real for this part of the world. You do see these sort of bright fields, and you do see these sort of deeper blue skies with this gorgeous sort of forest in the background. And the definition of the word lush. Now, admittedly, you don't necessarily see a multicolored purple, yellow, and cyan, magenta-colored, golden sort of serpent, but with many, many eyes. But I mean, the world would be better if you did, perhaps. Wonderful. So a bit more here about leading yourself through. Now, this obviously, by the way, is one of the pradvashas that are described in the story, the core of them. At least that's my interpretation of it. I didn't want to give away too much. But as we then run a bit further through the story, you can see there's, again, references to food and colors, and so much here that is in this book that I think is very nicely done, that allows you to use them as description. Now, I think this is true. If you look in all D&D books, they're like this, right? The difference is you're very used to those images and you kind of ignore them, right? If it's sort of you're wandering through the Frost Maiden and you see a firbolg and you describe a firbolg in Frost Maiden, it's like, yeah, it looks like a firbolg, right? Now, this stuff is, I think, going to be new to many people that are reading it, and I think that the art will definitely help. Cool. Okay, so there is some level of imperial presence here, and that obviously is a running theme through Unbreakable Revolution. And I think that again, that is part of the core of the narrative of this story. As we then kind of run our way towards the end of it, there's a beautiful sort of again mandala that is very common for Navratri or very many other festivals that I think is really nicely drawn as well. And then you end up with how do you finish off the adventure? And the author wants to thank Kevin and Viditya and Simon and J.R. Zambrano and Alex Guerrero for their continual guidance, as well as dedicated to their late grandmother, Pali Patel, and their mother, who have shared stories. And you can see that some of that those stories and that context has really clearly bled into the detail and joy of this person's description of a very particular part of India, and a very particular part of sort of Hindu culture that has been brought out in this story. And I think that's really nicely done. I think it's been very well done. So it's Charu Patel, who goes by she, her, South Asian game designer, writer, stream producer for All Nerds here in Valor Live. So there's a free plug for those folks who are aware of that. And explores themes of cultural identity, as we all do, the joy of play and nostalgia through performance and game design. So somebody after our own heart. Again, another beautiful picture here. Some discussion. Now, I want to briefly shout out all of the artists, because I think that the artists in this book have done an exceptional job. So we have Caroline Amaba, Alika Gupta, Kamiel Guisdala, Sonia Henar, and H. Ink Kugler, don't have a pronunciation guide there, Herman Lau, Joshua Mendenhall, Mia Mercury, Tiona Miche, Brian Fongluang Tam, and Anjeli Rafa, Tor Wah, Nicole Wilkinson, Catherine Emily Erlano Wilson, and Nala J. Wu. And as you can see, one of the nice things they do in this book, and I mentioned it before, is they're very, very good, and they are, I'd argue, the reference point for everybody, including us, to do attributions. They articulate their use of Unsplash. They articulate how they use Wikimedia Commons. And then there's a little bit here about the editors, who I genuinely think have done a great job. And so hats off to the editors. We're just going to briefly talk about the fact they have genuinely got sensitivity readers. Their sensitivity readers are primarily those folks who are of Asian descent but are in North America. I think that is fine. It is always good to get people to do your sensitivity reading who are from a cultural context, but it is one of the things to be aware of is that there is no, despite the fact I defined Asia earlier on in a kind of joking way as everything to the right of Asia Minor, there is no single thing that a sensitivity reader can resolve for you. So you've got sort of Daniel here and Viz, but the role of a sensitivity reader in theory is somebody that's going to look at the work that you've put out there and ensure that it is culturally both respectful, appropriate, accurate, and in essence, sensitive. And I think that is an important thing to have. And it's certainly something that the folks over at Wizards of the Coast, who I think often talk about this stuff, kind of like, oh, look at the stuff we've done. They clearly don't actually employ them to the same extent that I think these artists and creators at Unbreakable do. And I think there's a level of both ensuring that the form of each of these adventures has been appropriately met, so the content warnings and ensuring that there is pronunciation guide, that the cultural context is clearly articulated, that it is able to appropriately describe the setting without it being a polarized view. And I think that that's something that's super important. I think that so much of the cultural narrative has basically been from the perspective of the sort of the colonial imperialist, that it's not necessarily about having a equal and diametrically opposed perspective to create some sort of dialectic to then create a middle position that makes sense, right? I think it's more a case of saying, well, here are the perspectives that are at play here. And you're very familiar with one of them because it's the perspective that have been taught in school. Doesn't matter whether you grew up in the East or the West or anywhere, North or the South or otherwise, right? The reality is that's what you've been taught. That's what you've been told. And so seeing another view is going to be something that you're going to have somebody be able to say and articulate in a consistent way. And across a series of 7 adventures, doing that as an editor, it means you bring your own biases to it. So I do like the idea of having sensitivity editors. There is a point, and I think very well expressed actually, in the last adventure, which talks about the fact that actually that story is from somebody who is in culture for a series of small villages in Gujarat, which itself is a very small, no, that's not true, a very large and populous state. In India, which is a huge and very populous country, which only really came into existence as a single country in the 1950s. And previous to that was actually a hugely complex history that goes back thousands of years. Hinduism as a culture and Hinduism as a religion has been around for an awfully long time. And so, quite rightly, that author was very clear about not attempting to appropriate all of it, rather just putting forward their perspective on it. So it's not possible to have a single sensitivity reader that represents an entire culture. In fact, to be honest, even if you've got a single sensitivity reader that represented that particular set of villages from Gujarat, there may be differences of opinion there. But it's an awful lot better than having no sensitivity reader. And I think there is an important thing here, which is where one of the things I think I've talked about before and people have asked me about, which is like, oh, well, if I want to run a game or I want to do a game that is non-Eurocentric and bring it to life, how do I do it? Well, the first I would say is you look at the Unbreakable Adventures, because I think they've done a great job of it. But then I tend to talk about food and how you describe things and how you bring to life these places that hopefully you visited or you have some experience with. But the third thing is very much about making sure that if you are going to then publish work, if you're going to put work out as this work is on Drive-Thru RPG or DM's Guild or similar, then you need to make sure that somebody that is from that cultural context reads it and looks at it and says, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Or, I'm not sure about this. I don't know about it necessarily myself. But when I went and Googled it, given that I have a bit more cultural context, doesn't seem right. So I think there's an importance to that, and I think it's if you are creating content, if you are pushing things out onto to be used by third parties, as in me or our players or any other players in the audience or otherwise, it's worthy and wise, even if you're from the culture itself, to have somebody be a reader that is specifically there to identify and understand biases and compensate for them. And so there we go. So that's really the goal. Indeed, as Fifth Wisdom points out in our chat, it's not perhaps a few someone, so you don't expect a single person to act as an expert for an entire cultural group of people. And I think that's ultimately the point I was making, which I don't think, firstly, everybody comes at these things from their own experience of their own cultural context. And I mentioned, hey, look, both these folks are of Asian descent, but they are born and raised in the US, and so they live in multiple worlds. And the same thing with, Daniel is, based in Toronto. And so are they going to be an appropriate reader, a culturally sensitivity reader, for somebody talking about Filipino culture or, colonial Filipino culture in a particular part of the Philippines, because there are many islands. And then you the more you narrow down into a context, the less even a very thoughtful and educated sensitivity reader from a very different context is going to be able to do, other than potentially, with experience, point out and say, what, I don't know what this role is, this particular shaman or this particular priest or this particular person in the hierarchy, but it seems like that might be a danger area where you're misrepresenting something. And I think that's sort of the best that somebody would be able to do. I think then you run into the next piece, which then says, okay, well, cool. How do I then make sure that multiple eyes have looked at this and said, you know what, there is an interesting dynamic at the heart of what you're talking about here. I don't know if you want to address it, or if you do, then you need to look at it from these perspectives. And I think that there is a great point the fifth wisdom in our chat has made, which is that you do definitely want a few somebodies to be able to look over that. And I think that the burden on a published work rather than a performed work is higher. If you are publishing a work for other people to use, especially if you're doing what I think is very brave, which is the folks at Unbreakable are doing, which is they are putting forward something that they are purporting to be a way that people who are both from an Asian and non-Asian background can play and represent games that are authentically Asian. And that is something that they're doing. And I think it's a very brave thing to do, because you are choosing to represent an entire cultural context of a few billion people, which, let's be honest, that's it's big. We don't do that in the fourth culture. We choose to represent the cultural context of maybe 6 people and, a bunch of folks in our chat who loll along with us, right? But in order to do that, you're taking a huge risk, and you're taking the risk of being wrong, being disrespectful, being inappropriate, or trampling over hidden and subtle meanings in that by representing your own cultural context. And I think that is really the reason why there is the higher bar, and one of the reasons why we strongly support these folks who put out both at Unbreakable RPG, but in their latest release of Unbreakable Revolution, because the level of thought and diligence they put into this, the level of both affection and diligence they put into the work, it's professional. It's not a group of people farting around just for fun. It's folks who've actually thought about what it means to write things from a perspective that are representing a given specific culture in an anthology of work that is representing a much, much broader non-homogeneous series or set of cultures, not series. And they've put the work in. And I've got to say that I'm super pleased with it. I'm not sure. I'm going to transition a little bit now to talk a little bit about the games themselves and a few other pieces like that. But from the perspective of, is this an important and good thing that is worth your money? And actually, it's a great point. Let me just check through, have a quick look on Drive-Thru-RPG and see how much it costs. So is it worth 25 of your United States dollars? Yes, categorically yes. We've just been through it. It is. We're not sponsored. There's no, there's no money in it for us. There's nothing really in it for us at all, actually, other than the fact that we've used a couple of these adventures, and they were kind enough to send over a press copy so that we could, have a look at this one. But is it worth $25? Yes, absolutely, and some. I would argue it is worth that both as a reference manual for how to construct and be thoughtful about content. It is worth that for the art, just on its own, actually. And I would say that it's worth it for the stories. And I think that that's the thing I want to focus on now, because having talked about the cultural context and given a bit of an overview of each of the 7 stories in the book, I want to talk a little bit around my impressions of Unbreakable Revolution as opposed to Unbreakable Volume 1. And I think Volume 1 was specifically aimed at D&D, and the one we've been playing some of the games out of on the fourth culture. And that I think is now into a subjective opinion area. And so the first thing I'd say is Unbreakable Revolution. Go buy it. I will stick the link into our chat. I'll also, when we put this on YouTube, I will put it in the doobly-doo below. But it is, if you play games that are of a style where you have a bit of political conflict, you have an opportunity maybe to drop something in, 1970s horror story, a bit of something that is a bit of piracy on the high seas, and it is not going to just be a random arbitrary thing. That's great. If you want to play them as individual one-shots, that's good too. I think it's going to work quite well. They'll be very different from your classical fantasy one-shot, but I think it'll be good fun. I think for us, for me, reading through these things, these adventures, there's a great deal of joy at many of the stories and contexts, and there's a great deal of enjoyment at the narrative itself. But where I think it is a little different from Unbreakable One is that the multi-systemness has meant that they've had to generalize many of the stories, and they've had to remove some of the fantastical elements of it. And so one of the things I very much enjoy about the role-playing games I play is the pervasiveness of the fantastical. And so it's not to say there isn't any. I mean, let's be honest, right? There's a ghost story in one. The other one's got magical spirit creatures. There's there's the king rat. There's plenty of fantasy, as it were, in Unbreakable Revolution. But it is less fantasy and more magical realism in some ways, at least to my eyes, which I think is actually the core of this book. It is stories of Asian colonial context done with a fantastical or magical realism, author's eye, if you will, author's pen, how that works. And is that something that I personally am going to run some of these games? Maybe. I did like Days of Powder, Plunder, and Plot a great deal. I really enjoyed some of the themes inside the Crimson Uprising. I thought that the first Diya of Navratri had some very enjoyable ideas in it, and the concept of the Pradvashas. I really like the idea of their of animal spirits in general. I think that there's a great story there. But for me personally, I don't tend to run games based in the modern era, and that's just because I don't tend to do that. So if somebody asked me to play one of these games, would I do it? Absolutely. I think there's a lot to learn and a lot to enjoy about it. Would I play Bad Luck Fortune and some of the others? I tend to, as people know on the show, struggle with Chinese pronunciation, and I would be very worried about just being disrespectful of it. And so my natural tendency is not to want to run that game for sure, because my ability to authentically pronounce these words is significantly limited. And I think that is something that is, I'm all right with that. I think, we're lucky in the fourth culture where we have a broad range of people from diverse backgrounds, so I won't need to be that person. But I think that may be something that would intimidate a player, even though they go out of their way to make it possible. So I don't know that everything is universally applicable. I do think that if you are playing a game that allows you to drop in and out, I can imagine this being a sort of a quantum leap or a similar sort of series of adventures where you're able to jump from one to the other and kind of inhabit these bodies and solve a murder mystery, a bit like a Scooby-Doo or similar. I think that would be great fun. I think there's a lot of content in here for that. But just to summarize, I guess, and bring it all back to the net thesis of this, Unbreakable Revolution is a very thoughtful, well-edited series of stories and adventures set in more or less historically grounded Asian contexts, and it seems like it could be a lot of fun. And it's certainly a lot of inspiration, and it's got some amazing art in it, and it's got some really thoughtful and interesting plot lines. So I heartily recommend it. And it's definitely worth 25 of your dollars, and it's definitely worth at least having a good old look at it. Now, hopefully you've enjoyed this review. If you have, take a moment, please, and hit the follow button, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and do come back for more content. We're going to do a few more of these things. We're going to have a series of reviews, and we're also going to have a series of interesting dives into the mythology of some different monsters, both traditional D&D monsters as well as less traditional ones. That's coming up hopefully relatively soon. But hopefully you've enjoyed yourselves and had a good time. And I will see you all soon. Our next show is on Monday evening at 7 p.m. It is the next episode of The Fourth Culture, Survey Team 3, where our group of daring heroes continues their journey to, having just fought a big chunk of the Blood Company, or part of the expeditionary force. They're now heading off to reunite Bob and Ern, and Irsa's going to tell Bob a few home truths to let him make some decisions as a grown-up. And so on that note, I will bid you all a good evening, a good morning, and a good afternoon, I guess, wherever you are, and see you all next time. Take care. Bye.